During the Super Bowl final, my husband Marcus suddenly suggested we make a bet. Watching the game reach its halftime mark, he said casually, "If the Eagles win, we get a divorce." What do you say? The Eagles were leading by a landslide, and I already knew how this night would end before the clock ever ran out. What Marcus didn't know was that I had spent the entire afternoon staring at a photo his secretary Haley had posted, one that showed her cradling a sonogram and captioning it with a countdown to the day Marcus would finally make things official. He didn't know that I'd read every syrupy comment he'd left under her posts, disguised as workplace encouragement. He didn't know that 3 hours before kickoff, I had sat in my car outside my obstetrician's office holding my own positive test, staring at 2 pink lines that meant I was carrying his child too, and that instead of joy, all I felt was a cold, clarifying calm. So when he offered up our marriage like a coin flip, I didn't flinch. I said yes, because for the first time in years someone was finally giving me permission to stop pretending. I told him I wouldn't fight the divorce. What I did not tell him was that I had spent that same afternoon on the phone with my father's old attorney, a man who had drafted contracts for half the technology firms in the city, because 5 years ago, before I ever wore Marcus's ring, I had inherited something Marcus never fully understood: a silent, non-voting stake in Halloway Dynamics, the venture fund that had quietly financed the seed round of Marcus's own consulting firm. My maiden name had been scrubbed from the paperwork the day I married him, folded into a family trust so anonymous that even his company's general counsel didn't know whose signature ultimately sat above his CEO's. Marcus married a woman he thought needed him. He never once considered that he had built his entire empire on capital that belonged quietly to me. The drive home that night was unbearable in its stillness. Haley's voice note slipped through the car speakers before Marcus could silence it, bright and giddy, asking if the Eagles winning meant they could finally tell everyone about us. He cleared his throat and mumbled something about an old bet made before kickoff. I told him to have his lawyer draft the papers, and he seemed thrown by how easily I agreed, warning me there was no need to rush. I told him we wouldn't want to delay his big announcement, that Haley had waited long enough to be shown off in public instead of hidden away like an inconvenient secret. When we reached the house, he told me the power had gone out at Haley's apartment and that she was frightened of the dark, so he needed to go comfort her. I asked him to drop me at the corner instead. He hesitated only after I had already stepped out onto the sidewalk, calling after me that he might not make it home that night. I nodded and told him that was fine, because I had stopped expecting him home in any way that mattered months ago. Standing alone on that sidewalk with the porch light glowing behind me, I felt the strange lightness of a woman setting down a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it wasn't part of her own body. My best friend Amber texted asking where we disappeared to, and when I told her we were getting divorced, she immediately blamed Haley, calling her a homewrecker with more venom than I had energy to correct. She didn't know yet that the divorce wasn't a tragedy happening to me. It was a door I was finally choosing to walk through. Marcus and I had known each other 8 years, married for 5, and somewhere in the busy blur of his rising career, we had stopped being 2 people building something together and became 2 strangers performing a marriage for an audience that no longer existed. That night, curled on the couch in a house that suddenly felt enormous and hollow, I watched Haley post her hard launch to the world, a photo of her hand laced over Marcus's atop her sonogram report, captioned with congratulations to the Eagles and a declaration that her family of 3 was finally complete. My hand drifted instinctively to my own stomach, to the secret I had been carrying quietly for weeks, the one I hadn't told a single soul, not even Amber. I did not cry. I opened my phone and messaged my father's attorney again, asking him to expedite everything because for the first time, I understood exactly what kind of ending I wanted to write for myself. Marcus didn't come home for 3 days. Haley filled that silence with a parade of Instagram posts engineered less to celebrate her happiness and more to needle mine. Each one dropped at precisely the hour she knew I'd be alone. When I finally called Marcus to discuss logistics, it was Haley who answered on FaceTime, smug and glowing, informing me that Marcus was in the kitchen cooking her a prenatal meal, the same elaborate, careful meals he used to make for me back when he still noticed whether I was eating enough. I remembered how he used to fuss over my iron levels, how cooking for me had once been his love language before Haley rewrote the recipe entirely. Before I could respond, she sent a photo, one clearly meant to wound, and I set the phone face down on the counter and simply breathed. I had expected this cruelty. What I hadn't expected was the phone call I received the next morning from Marcus's own Q, a man named Desmond who had built the firm alongside him from nothing, asking with visible unease why Halloway Dynamics had suddenly frozen a scheduled funding tranche the company needed to close a critical acquisition. He assumed it was some bureaucratic hiccup. He had no idea the freeze had been authorized by me under my maiden name, the moment my attorney confirmed the trust documents were airtight. The truth was this: Marcus's firm was 2 weeks from finalizing a deal that would triple its valuation. A deal that depended entirely on the next scheduled disbursement from Halloway. He had spent the last 5 years building his identity around being a self-made visionary, never once acknowledging in interviews or investor decks that the earliest, Riskiest capital had come from a fund I quietly controlled through my late father's estate. I let the freeze sit for 4 days, watching from a careful distance as panic rippled through his executive team, as headlines began to whisper about a stalled deal and a nervous board. On the 5th day, I invited Marcus to lunch, not as his soon-to-be ex-wife, but as an investor requesting a meeting, and I watched his face shift from confusion to disbelief to something close to fear when he finally understood that the woman who signed the documents freezing his company's future was me. I told him, calmly, over untouched plates of food neither of us would eat, that he had spent 5 years thanking everyone for his success, except the one person who had actually made it possible, and that I was done being invisible in my own life. He tried anger first, accusing me of sabotage, then tried something softer, reminding me of the 8 years we'd shared, as if nostalgia could undo what indifference had already broken. I told him the divorce papers could proceed exactly as planned, and that this, the company, the terms, was simply the truth catching up to him. The final twist arrived not from me but from Haley herself 3 weeks later, when Amber forwarded me a screenshot from a mutual friend who worked in Haley's building. Haley's 2-month-long post had been staged weeks before she ever actually conceived, a calculated move to force Marcus's hand into leaving me before her real pregnancy, conceived far more recently than she'd led him to believe, could be traced back to a timeline that didn't add up. When the truth surfaced that the child Haley was carrying couldn't possibly be his given the dates, Marcus discovered in a single humiliating afternoon that he had shattered his marriage, gambled his company's stability, and destroyed his own reputation for a woman who had lied to accelerate an ending she wanted for reasons that had nothing to do with love. He called me that night, voice hollow, asking if I had known, and I told him the truth. I had known enough to protect myself, and that was where my obligation to him had ended the moment he offered our marriage up as a bet over a football game. I signed the divorce papers the following week without a single tremor in my hand, walked out of that courthouse into unexpectedly warm winter sunlight, and felt something in my chest unclench for the first time in years. Holloway Dynamics, now firmly re-established with my name attached in ink instead of shadow, would go on to become one of the most talked-about women-led funds in the city within the year, built quietly on the ashes of a marriage that had never truly been a partnership at all. Marcus's firm survived, diminished, humbled, no longer his sole crown to wear. Haley disappeared from the story entirely, chasing whatever version of a happy ending she'd been engineering all along. 6 months later, I gave birth to a daughter with dark curls and Marcus's same stubborn chin, and I named her after my mother instead of anyone tied to the marriage that almost swallowed me whole. I built a nursery in a house that belonged only to me, painted in colors I chose without asking anyone's opinion. And for the first time in a decade, my life felt entirely, unmistakably authored by my own hand. There were nights the loneliness still crept in, quiet and uninvited, reminding me of the 8 years I couldn't get back, of the version of myself who used to believe love meant shrinking to fit someone else's ambition. I never remarried. I never needed to. Marcus had bet our marriage on a football game, certain he already knew how the story would end. He never imagined that the real ending had already been written, long before that final whistle blew, by the wife he never once thought to ask what she actually wanted.